Hello and welcome to Biber Hunter Scale Models. In this video I want to show how I painted this beautiful bust by Dynamo Models using acrylic paints. And creating a matching custom base to this Battle of the Bulge bust is also shown here. So if this might sound interesting to you, please stay tuned. This is the main protagonist of this video, the US Medic bust by Dynamo Models. It consists of 3 pieces, the torso, a helmet and the head. All pieces are beautifully sculpted and looked very promising. I started with removing the bigger casting residues and branches with my Dremel in my garage, so I don't end up with that toxic resin dust in my hobby room. I then used my hobby knife to remove the smaller residues, but that was not much work as the pieces were casted rather clean. They were more on the typical places like in folds and on the backside of the neck, which are pretty much on all busts I made so far, and no big deal when scribing them away gently with a sharp blade. The bridge of the nose was too sharp and edged for my taste, so I here too smoothened and rounded it more with my hobby knife. And this also helps to make this piece a bit more unique and lift it from the mass. To lift details, make them stand out more or increase them, I started with scribing alongside them with the sharp tip of my hobby knife. This separates pieces like this belt from the jacket or whatever is underneath, and also helps to create guiding lines for the following tool. And that would be AK's engraving scriber. With that I went along the details in the just scribed path by the knife. And this not only increases the lifting effect, it also helps to emphasize details like the zipper, which were not lifted but deepened, to be more defined and because of that more visible. To finish this step, I used a diagonally cut cocktail skewer and with that went along the just scribed areas. This smoothens the resin surface and sharp edges that would be created by scribing under the belts or bracelet, for example. And this is looking way more defined and sharp to me, and with some paint these details will stand out even more instead of flowing into the surface. The knife's tip was then used to mark the spots where I then drilled holes and then glued a rod into the torso, which will act as a handle while painting and as a piece what connects the bust to the base later. And like this could place it in my very professional painting stand. The smaller pieces like the head and helmet were placed on toothpicks and then pushed into corks for better handling while painting. The collar had a small hole, but that was an easy fix. I mixed me some green stuff 2-part putty and pushed it into the hole with a toothpick, which was slightly moistened. And a silicone brush was useful for smoothing the surface, and after it dried I sanded it with a fine sanding stick. Better now. Now I could clean the pieces in preparation for painting. I brushed them with soapy water to remove dirt and dust from sanding and grease for my fingers. That helps the paint to adhere better on that smooth resin. And sped up the drying process with my airbrush. For the primer I chose Mr. Surfacer diluted with leveling thinner, because I was sure here that this lacquer based primer has a good adhesion to the smooth surface. And I decided on this brown tone to have a dark but warm foundation for the then following pre-coloring. For this pre-coloring I started with mixing me a dark fleshy tone for the head. This was then sprayed onto the whole head like a base paint, and I made sure to especially hit the dark places where shadows would be. Then I mixed me a lighter flesh tone and sprayed this in a flat angle from above to hit the raised areas that would be hit by light shining from above. This tone doesn't have to look like the final flesh tones, as I will paint these by brush later. It's just a lighter tone to mark the raised spots. I then use the new AK Real colors to mix me a dark base tone for the jacket. They spray like a dream, and the new drop bottles are great to constantly mix paints and end up with the same result, instead of just guessing the amount because of dosing paints with a toothpick out of jars with wide openings. Like before on the head, the dark base paint, aka shadow paint, was sprayed as a base layer, making sure it reached every dark spot and folds. Then again, the next step was mixing a bright highlight paint and again sprayed in a flat angle from above. And here I could already see the effect of undercutting and scribing gaps because the highlight paint didn't reach these gaps and details like the belt were outlined by the still visible dark primer. The helmet was pre-colored the same way, dark green as a base paint and a lighter version sprayed from above. And that's the result of the pre-coloring airbrush stage, and I could now finally move on to the brush painting stage. I wanted to start with the head and here began with a dark reddish wash to outline the facial details like the eyes, nose or ears. This not only highlights them but also sets the first deeper shadows. I made sure to collect excess paint with a dry brush and used it to also blend the edges of the paint smooth by blending it. I like to paint the eyes first because this gives me a better feeling for the face and viewing direction, and as this is a tricky task, I don't want to mess up a painted face by making mistakes while painting the eyes. And the first step was to paint the eyes white. Next I painted the general position of the iris by starting with a dark circle, what will be the outlining limber ring. And I apologize if my filming wasn't perfect here, but it's tough to paint such details and be in a good position for the camera. Then I painted the colored iris and I chose for a light brown here. I painted it into the dark circle I painted previously and made sure to let the dark outlining limber ring stay visible. Into the center of the colored iris were the black pupils painted. Of course, while painting the eyes, I had to be aware that this guy is looking to his right, what has an influence on the shape and position of the eyes, and some reference pictures came in handy here. As a last detail, I added some light reflections into the iris, what gives an illusion of light reflecting in the eyes and makes them a bit more lifelike. And these are the finished eyes with a kind of skeptical look from this fella. Not perfect, but I like it. With the eyes done, I could start adding the skin tones, and I started with the basic skin tone for the face. The paint was applied diluted with retarder, so it gets a bit translucent and stays workable longer, so I can blend it with a soft retarder moistened brush. This light paint was applied onto the more brighter areas of the face where less or no shadows would be, and so can also be called the first highlight. I then painted the first shadow paint, which is just slightly darker than the basic tone, into the darker areas of the face and set the first shadows. And as this bust is set in the dark and cold winter woods of Bastogne, I was aiming for a dark and cold looking face. The paint was, like always, applied diluted with retarder and blended into the surface with a soft brush. The next step was applying a darker shadow paint into the even darker areas like the lower cheeks, the jaw, sides of the nose or around the eyes and ears. Painting this face was a challenge for me because I painted my first busts with oil paints over an acrylic pre-coloring, and I always wanted to try a bust with acrylics only. Acrylic paints behave differently. They seem to be somehow thicker even if diluted, and this was a process of learning for me, and I didn't reach my wanted result immediately. So I had to go back and forth and try around a bit until I was somehow satisfied with the result. Anyway, after the second shadow I started to bring in some highlights with a bright mix. This was applied onto the more light exposed areas like the cheekbones, back of the nose or chin. I then lightened up the mix more and painted the next highlight onto the more exposed areas. And as usual, the brighter the paint became, the smaller the painted areas were. Next came several glazes with flashy paints. These glazes were supposed to smoothen out the hard transitions and vary the cold looking highlights and bring them back into a more flashy direction. Like I said, a lot of try and find out, but also realizing again that almost every mistake can be corrected. And again, a soft blending brush helped me to integrate the paint into the face's surface. To add some rosiness to the face, I made a strongly diluted red glaze into the shadows. This gave the shadows and the whole face a more flashy and lifelike look. It also increases the shadow effect and can turn the face darker, what wasn't a bad thing in general, as like I said before, this piece is set in a more dark environment. At this point I was still divided between looking terrible and doing okay, but I stayed with it and didn't give up. With the dark grayish blue I painted a 5 o'clock or bearded shadow. This was applied on the lower area like the jaw and under the chin, heavily diluted with retarder so it's not too opaque. And I also applied it under the eyes to imply a fatigue look. As I was still a bit unhappy with the hard transition between shadows and highlights, I brushed some pure retarder onto the face and then added with retarder diluted paint next to the edges of the highlights. And by blending this applied paint with a soft brush, I managed to smoothen out the transitions at least a bit more. Now I was a bit more happy with the look of the face, but wanted to add one last detail. I grabbed me a dark purple ink by AK, diluted it heavily with tap water, and spread this with very low pressure into the shadows. I was hoping that this would give the face a cold, winter-like look, but it also helped to blend the shadows and smoothen the transitions even more. And if some paint pooled or was getting too thick, I could blend it into the surface with a moistened brush. Lastly, the lips were also goldened, if this is the right word here. And with that I called the face done, and after a lot of struggling and doubts I came to a somehow to me satisfying result and could now move on to the helmet. I started with painting a thin layer of green over the pre-colored piece. And because I wanted to get more into a cold grey blue direction, I made a second run in exactly that color, filter like very diluted again. Then I could test the new AK Real color markers by painting all the details like the chin strap. This was so quick and easy it almost felt like cheating. Of course that could also be done by brush, but as I see it as a hobby scale modeler, saving time here and there with using a marker, no paint filling in a palette, no brush cleaning, just a quick grab and paint the strap, time saving is always welcome. I wanted to experiment a bit more, so I grabbed me a light green and started to paint some small chips and scratches onto the helmet surface. This worked out well, but I had to be careful to not put too much pressure on the tip as it's very soft. To add smaller and finer chips, I tried to combine the markers with a sponge. I painted the sponge, so to say, and dipped it onto the helmet. This worked very well and the paint dries very quick on the sponge, so I didn't have to be worried about too much or too big chips. With a dark aluminum marker I added some metal chips to the edge where the paint would be worn off to the metal more easily. I wanted to create a dirty and worn out surface, so I applied a good layer of hairspray, my only use for this stuff as a bald man, and let it dry for a few minutes. And then sprayed a light grey and a light brown in an irregular pattern on top of it. When this had some time to dry, I wetted the surface to reactivate it and with a soft brush chipped the paint down. I here tried to create an irregular look and pushed the brush gently with a stippling motion or streak-like downwards from above. To secure this work and fix it in place, I then applied a layer of flat varnish from the new Real Colors range. Because the color of the marker I used on the chin strap somehow didn't match with the label, it came out way too light. I used a dark brown ink by AK to put this like a filter on top of it. And it came out so nice, I was happy I was forced to try this. Then came a, for me, very tricky part, painting the red crosses magic symbols. To place them symmetrically, I used a calipers to somehow mark two opposite points on the helmet, and then with a white watercolor pencil painted the approximate position and size of the white circles. When I was at least a bit satisfied, I grabbed me some bright, almost white acrylic paint and painted the circles over a layer of hairspray, because I again wanted to give them a worn-out look with chipping. And again, when the paint had some time to dry, I used tap water and a soft brush to reactivate the paint and made some light chipping. Next came the red crosses, and I here again used a red watercolor pencil to mark the approximate position of the cross in the circle. And then used red acrylic paint over some hairspray again and tried to paint some red crosses that somehow looked symmetrically and even sized, what was not an easy job. But I always prefer to try paint things hand-free for practice and experience, even if the result may be not that perfect yet. And as a last step, I again chipped them a bit to give them a slightly worn out look. To knock down the glossy shine from the hairspray and fix my work in place, I put on a layer of Bergswerk's matte varnish, one of the best on the market in my opinion. Super flat and great result. With the helmet done, I could glue it to the head with a few drops of superglue. I here made sure that it was sitting in the right position and angle. In general, I'm happy with the helmet, although the crosses aren't perfect, but perfection is seldom reached, especially by me. The last missing piece was the torso or jacket, and I here started with redefining and amplifying the shadows. Like often and like I do it on smaller figures, I herefore use dark brown paint, strongly diluted with retarder. The paint was applied and then with a soft blending brush moistened with retarder, I smoothed out the edges and transitions. I also used this paint slightly thicker to again outline details like the belt or zipper. Usually I use smaller brushes even on busts, but this time I wanted to try out bigger brushes because I was hoping to be faster and I saw the real good guys using them. My brush here was a Da Vinci size 4 in the medium price area and it was going fine after some time to get used to the brush. Next I mixed me the first highlight paint, which was generously applied on the areas that should be brighter because they are raised and exposed to light. This paint again was diluted with retarder and blended into the surface. The painted area with this first highlight was rather huge, as it covers almost every area that is somehow hit by light. So, except the shadowed areas, I painted it almost everywhere except the transition zones. For the second highlight I lightened up the mix and with that painted in smaller amount the areas that would receive more light because they are higher or more raised and exposed. And again the paint was diluted and blended for smooth transitions. For the last and highest highlight I brightened up the mix even more and with that bright mix painted the most exposed and raised areas. The painted areas here were the smallest I painted with the highlight paints. This not only brought out the brightest parts, but created a strong contrast between the dark and lighter areas. I also used this brightest paint to create some texture to the seams by painting the raised spots in the light color. This adds additional detail to the jacket and makes the piece more interesting, also emphasizing these details. As a last step for the jacket, I made several glazes over the whole piece except the seams, to unify the painted areas and hide the strokes of the brush a bit. This also slightly turned down the contrast a bit, what was okay, because there is plenty of it. And like I said, this piece is placed in dark winter woods, so the dark shadows and a strong contrast were fitting for me here. With the dry brush I collected pooling paint so it's not covering the darker shadows, and with that I could move on to painting the details. I started with the belt by base painting it with a thin layer of paint, so the remnants of the pre-coloring could show through. I then darkened the base paint and applied it into the darker shadowed areas of the belt, again using diluted paint. And as a counterpart I used a lighter mix for painting the highlighted areas where more light would fall. To make the belt more interesting, I wanted to create some fabric texture one can see on those belts when looking closely. I therefore used a bright paint and painted it in a crossed pattern with just slightly diluted paint. This is looking very weird and too strong at this point, but I would take care of this in the next step. And that would be putting several layers of thin glazes with the base paint on top of that. The glazes tone down the bright pattern and integrates it into the belt surface. I repeated the glazes several times until I was satisfied with how it got toned down and integrated. I then darkened the glazing paint and applied this darker glaze into the darker areas of the belt to again get the shadowed areas a bit darker, as the fabric texture covered and neutralized the previously painted shadows almost completely. And this is the, to me, satisfying result. For the collar I started with a dark brown base paint and then used a brighter brown tone to paint the upper edge and raised areas, not covering them completely to break the dark brown surface. I then made a dark green glaze to unify the two tones and switch the color a bit into a slightly more greenish direction. Next I grabbed me these two artified dry brushing brushes and with some lightened up paint worked out the highest spots of the collar, what would catch the most light or show the most wear and tear. And with an orangish glaze I gave these areas a bit more color again, as the result after the dry brushing came out a bit too greyish for my taste. As a last step for the color, I used heavily diluted dark brown paint again to do a kind of pin wash to emphasize the grooves and get them dark like they should be. The armlet was base painted with a whitish tone, the shadows worked in with a medium grey and the highlights with a small amount of pure white. The upper edge of the red cross was painted with red acrylic paint after again marking the position with a watercolor pencil. And I didn't paint it with complete coverage to make it look less brand new. Then came finally the point to unite the two parts, and with a few drops of super glue I glued the head in place. I here made sure that the angle is matching, as he is supposed to look to his right, and I tested the positions before without glue. Always great to see coming together what belongs together. I wanted to create some additional shadow effects, and for that I used a dark brown ink by AK and diluted it with tap water strongly, similar to the one I used on the face. This was then sprayed very thin with very low pressure into the lower and darker areas of the jacket, like the folds and armpits. I built up this effect in several layers, sometimes using a soft brush for blending and giving the previous layer some time to dry. And this also helped a bit to smoothen out the contrast a bit more. Similar to a glaze, the effect here was very subtle at first because of the inks being strongly diluted, but it added to the overall picture one more detail. Unfortunately, a medic's job is a bloody one, and I wanted this guy to show it. So I brushed some pure retarder on the jacket and then added some pure red paint into it. Like this, the paint flows in all directions, creating irregular stains. And because of the retarder, I have a lot time to move it, blend it, push it around with a blending brush until I was satisfied with the shape and size. And it also helps to make the stains transparent and not completely opaque. The last step on the bust itself was to paint the underside and the pole black. This was a good opportunity to try brushing the new real colors, and it went pretty smooth. The pure paint is slightly thicker, has a good coverage and dries out quick and completely flat. To properly present this bust, I created this base, and after priming and base painting it in a brown tone, I again used AK's dark brown ink to make the surface a bit more interesting. I brushed it pure onto the surface, and this added a transparent layer and creates more depth, a very interesting effect on the smooth and round surface. To paint the lettering, I used one of the real color markers, and this made it so quick and easy. I again asked myself if I was cheating. Painting this by brush would have taken me way longer, with the potential to make more mistakes. Again, saving time here and there is always welcome, and this is a good step to achieve this. I applied 2 layers, what is good to me considering the light paint on the dark ground. I wanted the snow element from the Battle of the Bulge to be represented on this base, so I used AK snow products here. I mixed the snow sprinkles and balloons in equal parts and added a few drops of still water to make it more liquid and a few drops of wet effects for some glossy wet shine. This mix was then applied with a stiff brush and pushed in the general position, trying to create an irregular pattern what could build up in a winter wonderland. And with pure still water I spread and pushed the snow mix to the places where I wanted it to be, smoothed out the build-ups from the applying by brush and blended it. On top of that I sprinkled the microballoons so they get caught in the wet paste and create a look of fresh powdered snow. The excess was then knocked off and collected on a piece of paper so I could refill it into the bottle to use it again. This was then repeated on the lettering and the base, as snow can accumulate on every small protruding edge and surface. And this made the whole piece even more snowy and winter-like to me. Because the sides were too clean looking for my taste, I used this dark enamel product and applied it with a vertical motion. This not only was supposed to imply dirt flushed down by rain, but also gave the snow in the lower area a cool muddy look. Almost like some soldiers marching through the thawing snow, making it a muddy mess. And for some variation and fresher dirt I applied a second lighter layer on top of that, again with a vertical motion, blending it into the surface like some water streaks washed this pattern into the side of the base. And with this dry stiff brush I tried to increase the strikes effect by swiping it dry over the slightly dried enamels. I let the snow on the top untouched like on a roof, with the snow on the ground being slightly muddy and dirty. I wanted the base to look slightly wet, like a part what is outside in the winter environment, so I brushed just slightly diluted wet effects onto the surface, again with a vertical motion to give it a slightly glossy shine. Now I could finally glue the bust in place, and after I played around with positions and making sure it's in the right angle and straight, I applied a few drops of super glue to fix it where I wanted it to be. When I was absolutely sure the position and angle was right, I added a bigger amount of super glue on the inside, hoping it will stay there forever. Now I only had to integrate the pole into the base's surface, and I again used the snow paste mixture and applied it around the pole. This also helps to give additional support to the glue. I then blended the snow paste with still water and finished the snow by sprinkling the microballoons on top. And with that being made, I could finally call this piece done. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it when you made it until here. I'm very pleased with my result. I learned a lot painting a bust with acrylic paints, and I hope you like my result as much as I do. Even after struggling at first, I was able to somehow finish this to a result I can look at with joy. I'm looking forward to your feedback and constructive criticism, and if you liked what you saw and maybe felt entertained, I would be happy if you consider supporting me by subscribing. So, enough talking from me. Thanks again for watching, stay safe, and until the next time.